Well, welcome to another episode of Run, Walk, Talk Tales of Inclusion and Development. I'm Judy Borvich, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'm here with Steph Redivo, and her pronouns are she and her. And today is actually part two of our conversation on data. And so in part one, we really focused on data and learning and development. And then today, we are going to focus about data in EDI. And as usual, Steph, let's just jump right in.
Yeah.
Why is data important in EDI?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really big question. And, I think about
It
it
is.
quite a bit. And I really do think, I mean, you really can't manage what you don't measure. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
if you think of the data that you get today, I mean, on my Fitbit, I get a sleep score. I know how many minutes I've exercised to hit my limit. You know what I mean for fitness.
Mm-hmm.
So, I really think gathering data on equity, diversity, and inclusion is absolutely critical. It's critical to sort of your starting point and really kind of kickstarting your efforts. And then you have to do it on a regular basis. I mean, our systems weren't created equitably, right? So in order for us to become equitable, we need to know the numbers. And when I kind of think about the numbers and, when I'm looking at data, I'm thinking of both qualitative and quantitative. And
Mm-hmm.
the qualitative data, that can be found in your engagement survey or inclusion surveys. And I mean, there's lots of software out there like Gallup, that can give you that sort of the perception of inclusion for your employees. And then the quantitative piece is usually based on self-identification data, such as asking those demographic questions, such as, do you identify as a person with a disability or do you identify as an Indigenous person? So
Mm-hmm.
those are a couple ways. Yeah.
And do you have any suggestions when people are perhaps hesitant to share that data with their company? I mean, have you seen that within an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime you're asking someone to identify with something that's very personal, there is a lot of sort of change management and discussions that have to happen, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you really have to kind of focus on why are you collecting the data? What is the data going to be used for? And I think this, I have seen this takes years to discuss depending upon the organization. Like it's an
Mm-hmm.
ongoing conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
because people have experiences potentially where if you identify with having a disability, there could be consequences. So the next organization they go to, they don't feel safe to speak up. So they're not going
Right.
to, and they're not going to identify until they actually feel, okay, the organization is walking the talk and wants to know and is willing to sort of support me. So it takes time.
Well, I think that's an excellent point about, why when you're collecting this sort of data, you want to be transparent with people and absolutely let them know what you're going to be using it for. So you
Yeah.
spoke about the why for collecting data in EDI, and I'm curious, how do you measure progress then around EDI with that data?
Yeah. So if we look at kind of engagement surveys, right? So with
Hmm.
engagement surveys, you could be measuring that perception of inclusion, for potentially say the year one, you get almost like a baseline of how do people feel? Like, do they feel included? Do they belong? Can they speak up? All of those things to kind of get a score. And then what happens is then you need to obviously, change some programming, do
Hmm.
something to make it more safer in your organization, and then potentially track again the next year to keep sort of track of that. Now, when we talk about kind of the self identification data, keeping track of that data, and as you sort of talked about, asking me the question around how comfortable are people, I will say, this is very uncomfortable. And especially I will call it for white people. And I
Hmm.
think, sometimes, white people feel like that the only way that they sort of got ahead or got the job or the promotion was that they worked really hard, which of course they probably have. But it's also, there's other factors that come into play, other biases, such as the hiring manager, thinks, oh, you remind me of myself when I was your age, or maybe someone in your family has a connection to a VP in the company. And so it just isn't sort of the talent and hard work that kind of gets you, the job. I feel like this is a whole other discussion we could talk about
I was gonna
around
say
bias,
we'll
right?
save that for
Yeah, yeah.
a future podcast. Absolutely.
I will say though, I mean, when there's certain laws in place, gathering the data can be easy because, legally you have to. And I think in BC here, to give an example, we have our pay transparency legislation that's in effect in 2023. Companies are going to have to share their pay transparency. They're going to have to collect gender data, which they may have not collected before, or maybe they have systems that just have male and female. And so now they're needing to collect non-binary data. And so we have to kind of, keep in mind that there may be some systems that you either have to modify, or you have to find a workaround to do surveys. So, but let me share sort of two examples really that I've seen to kind of show some progress around the whole data collection piece. So I've seen sponsorship programs where, you collect, who gets sponsored and promoted. So this is really interesting because, you may have seen, or the listeners here may have sort of seen, the image of like the diverse employees at the bottom rung. And then as it goes up, it gets lighter and lighter and whiter and whiter. Well, having a really robust sponsorship program, looks out for that, and keeping track of who's getting promoted and who's moving up in the organization can sort of help to support that for sure. And then the other interesting piece too, because sometimes I think when we talk about data and equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's just the how many women are coming in, or, that sort of percentage and that number. But what about keeping track of who's applying to your jobs, right? And so what I've seen some companies do is, partnerships also, which it could also be a separate discussion too, in equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? You may be partnering with different organizations. So let's say you partner with an organization supporting people with disabilities, and you do a targeted campaign around specific roles. Do you see an increase in the number of people with disabilities applying? This is also another way to sort of start to kind of track that. But there's lots of discussions that sort of leadership has to have too, right?
No, I like both of those examples that you've shared, and I also see another podcast just about diving into qualitative versus quantitative data, and what do we mean, and how do we do data analysis? Because
Yeah.
I also, in hearing your examples, I think probably, and you may have be able to speak to this, people may be surprised. Like they may think we're hiring, we're being really equitable and fair, and then you actually look at the data and you go, oops, like perhaps
Yeah.
things aren't as fair as we thought. And so without data, you don't necessarily get that picture.
That's right. Well, it sheds the light on it, doesn't it? Because when we don't have the
Hmm.
data, there's lots of sort of assumptions and miscommunication and misperceptions and all these things. Yeah.
So just to go in a little bit of a different direction, then, what are some of the pitfalls that you've seen with data in EDI?
Yeah. So I think, I have seen throughout the years, or have heard, other practitioners talk about you know, uh, managers don't believe the data and they want to dispute it, which is really interesting because the data is the data. But there's multiple different ways to kind of interpret it. So I think that is one kind of pitfall. I think another pitfall too, when it comes to gathering data, and especially that self ID data, people are nervous, and then and our managers and our leadership, are anxious potentially to collect it. They may not want to. So having kind of a really transparent, uncomfortable conversation with leadership to sort of discuss what makes sense for our organization to collect. What are we going to collect? Why are we going to collect? Where are we going to kind of start? So, and I think it's and I think sometimes our, employees just want us to collect the data and get on with it. But I think,
Mhm.
our leadership has to have these discussions to really understand and kind of wrestle with this discussion before just gathering data, just because we should gather data, you
Well,
know?
there's a real change management exercise, it sounds
Yes.
like you're describing, where you need to really think about how are you going to communicate it to your employees. Again, we talked about being transparent, letting them
Hmm.
know, why you're collecting the data. What about when it comes to sharing that data that you've collected? What is your experience with sharing with the organization at large information about that data that may be personal? Do you share
Yeah.
it or don't you?
Yeah. You know what? We share it, but it's aggregated, right?
Right.
So we never want to be sort of sharing data that potentially that could go back to sort of someone so that so that it's aggregated. But I think, you know what, you touch upon a really good point around, because I think sometimes what happens is, and this has nothing to do with the data collection, but we get into sort of the change management piece of, you do the survey, you get some information, you're discussing with leadership, that takes some time, you're getting an action plan,
Mm,
and it's months before you share the data. and
right.
and that's really, like, that's troubling, because your employees lose sort of this feeling of, okay, you asked me to share, I shared with you,
What's
now what are
going
you
on?
doing, what's going
Yeah.
on, like, share with me, like, and just don't just share the data, because that's the interesting piece too when you think about data collection is, sure, you get the data, but it's like, okay, so now you have it, what are you doing with it,
Now
organization,
what?
or
Yeah.
now what, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What action are you going to take?
Yes.
Especially, and I mean, um, if you realize that you need to adjust your hiring practices, let's say you need to
Yeah,
adjust and be promoting differently within your organization. You realize that there is bias within your organization. Presumably, once you do share that data, yeah, people want to know what's next. How are you going to solve this problem?
that's right. That's right.
Okay.
And quickly, right?
Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting and enlightening to hear all of that information. And we always end with, something that we've learned. And in our part one, you mentioned something that you learned from me sharing about L&D data, and I have certainly learned a lot with you sharing. And I think probably the big learning moment for me and something that I'm going to action is thinking about it in the hiring process. So actually potentially
Mhm.
setting some criteria for, how am I going to know if I'm getting a diverse range of people, if I'm understanding you correctly, and correct me
Yeah,
if I'm not. How am I going to make sure that I am getting a really diverse population actually applying for the position? How
that's
am I
right.
going to track that? And then if I'm not, what might I need to do to ensure
Mhm.
that the actual hiring process and who I'm attracting is fair?
Yeah, that's great.
Well, thanks, Steph, and thanks everybody for joining us for another episode of Run, Walk, Talk Tales of Inclusion and Development. Until next time.
Take care.